The storm had been building for hours, pressing against the glass walls of the penthouse like something alive, something angry, something waiting to break. Rain streaked down the towering windows in silver lines, blurring the glittering city far below into a trembling haze of light. Inside, everything was silent. Too silent. The kind of silence that made every second feel heavier than the last. Isabella Morty sat alone on the velvet couch, her body curled slightly inward as if she could shield herself from the emptiness that had swallowed the room. One hand rested over the curve of her stomach, instinctive, protective. 6 months. The child moved softly beneath her palm, a quiet reminder that she wasn't alone, even if it felt like she was. The other hand gripped her phone so tightly her knuckles had gone pale, her fingers numb from waiting. She had stopped checking the time an hour ago. It didn't matter anymore. Alessio came when he wanted, or when he remembered he had a wife at all. Lightning flashed across the sky, illuminating the penthouse in a brief, harsh glow. For a second her reflection stared back at her from the glass, tired eyes, soft features worn down by sleepless nights, and a sadness she no longer knew how to hide. This place was supposed to be everything. Power, protection, a future. But lately it felt more like a cage made of glass and gold. Then the sound came. Keys scraping against the front door. Her breath caught. The lock turned slowly, unevenly, followed by the heavy push of the door swinging open. Cold air slipped inside, carrying the scent of rain and something else, something sharper, something that made her stomach twist before she even saw him. Alessio Morty stepped inside like a man who owned not just the room, but the world itself. His tailored suit was wrinkled, his tie loose, his collar open just enough to reveal the careless state he was in. His dark hair was slightly disheveled, his eyes glassy with alcohol. But it wasn't the whiskey that hit her first. It was the perfume. Sweet floral, unmistakably not hers. It clung to him like a second skin. He didn't look at her right away. He never did anymore. He tossed his jacket carelessly onto the marble floor, the fabric sliding across the polished surface like it meant nothing, like everything here meant nothing, like she meant nothing. "Where have you been?" Isabella's voice came out softer than she intended, fragile, as though it might shatter if it tried to be stronger. Alessio let out a low, humorless chuckle as he loosened his collar further, finally turning his gaze toward her. There was something cold in his eyes tonight, something distant, something that no longer even pretended to care. "Don't start," he muttered, his voice thick with irritation. "You wouldn't understand." Her hand pressed tighter against her belly as she slowly stood, her body aching with the movement. "Business doesn't smell like another woman." The words slipped out before she could stop them, trembling but sharp enough to cut through the room. For a moment, the storm outside seemed to pause. Then Alessio's expression changed. Not to guilt, not to regret. To something uglier. His lips curled into a smirk, slow and cruel. "You think you're in a position to question me," he said, stepping closer, his voice lowering with each word. "You sit here all day, doing nothing, waiting for me like that." His gaze flicked briefly to her stomach, dismissive, like that makes you important. The words hit harder than any slap could have. Isabella felt them settle deep inside her chest, heavy, suffocating. "I'm your wife," she whispered, her voice breaking despite her effort to hold it together. "I'm carrying your child. I deserve." "The truth," he cut in sharply, laughing under his breath. "You want the truth." He took another step closer, close enough that she could smell the alcohol on his breath, close enough that the scent of that woman wrapped around her like an insult. "The truth is you're a burden," he said quietly, his voice dropping into something cold and final. "You're weak, replaceable. Do you have any idea how many women would kill to be in your place?" Something inside her cracked. Not loudly, not dramatically. Just enough. "I loved you," she said, barely audible now, her eyes searching his face for something, anything, left of the man she had once believed in. "Don't do this. Don't throw everything away." That was the moment. The moment everything ended. His hand moved faster than her mind could process, cutting through the space between them with brutal precision. The sound echoed through the penthouse like a gunshot. Her head snapped to the side, the impact sending a sharp burst of pain across her cheek. For a second she couldn't feel anything else. Not the room, not the storm, not even herself. Just silence. Thick, suffocating silence. Her body staggered backward, instinct taking over as both hands flew protectively to her stomach. The baby moved sharply beneath her touch, and that, more than anything, brought her back. Her breath came in uneven bursts as she slowly turned her head, her palm pressing against the burning mark on her cheek. Her eyes met his again, but this time, there was no confusion left in them. No denial. Only clarity. Alessio stood there, his chest rising and falling, his expression twisted between arrogance and something darker, something unstable. "Don't look at me like that," he growled. "You made me do it." The words hung in the air, toxic and absurd. And for the first time, she didn't believe him. The fear was still there, clawing at her chest, telling her to stay quiet, to survive, to endure. But something else had taken root beneath it, something stronger. Her fingers tightened around the phone she still held. The child inside her shifted again. That was enough. Slowly her hand steadied. Slowly she lifted the phone. Alessio's eyes flickered, confusion cutting through his anger for the first time. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice sharpening. She didn't answer. Her fingers moved on their own. 3 numbers. Simple, final, unforgivable. She pressed the phone to her ear, her voice trembling but clear. "My husband," she said, swallowing hard as the words forced their way out, "he hit me. I'm pregnant. Please send someone." For a second, nothing moved. Then Alessio froze. And the storm outside didn't feel nearly as dangerous as the silence that followed inside. The moment the words left Isabella's lips, the world inside the penthouse seemed to tilt, as if the very foundations of power and silence that had held it together for years had just cracked beneath her feet. The dispatcher's calm voice flowed through the phone, steady and controlled, asking questions, giving instructions, but it sounded distant compared to the roaring in Isabella's ears. Her heartbeat thundered so loudly it nearly drowned everything else out. She could feel Alessio watching her now, really watching her, and that alone told her she had crossed a line no one in his world ever dared to cross. Breaking the law was expected in his life. Breaking silence was not. "Stay on the line, ma'am. Officers are on their way. Are you safe right now?" the voice asked again, sharper this time, more urgent. Isabella swallowed, her throat dry, her gaze locked on the man who had once promised to protect her from everything. Now he looked like the danger itself. "No," she whispered, her voice barely holding together. "He's still here." The words felt like a blade cutting through the air, slicing open a truth that could never be taken back. Alessio's expression shifted slowly, like a storm gathering behind his eyes. The arrogance that had filled his posture moments ago began to fracture, replaced by something far more dangerous than anger, panic wrapped in fury. "Hang up," he said quietly at first, his voice low, controlled, almost calm. It was the kind of calm that came before violence. "Isabella, hang up the phone." He took a step forward, and instinctively she stepped back, her hand tightening protectively over her belly. The distance between them felt like a fragile barrier, one that could shatter with a single move. "No," she said, surprising even herself with how steady it sounded. The dispatcher's voice continued in her ear, urging her to move somewhere safer, to keep distance, to stay alert, but Isabella wasn't listening anymore. She was focused only on him, on the man who had just shown her exactly who he truly was. Alessio let out a sharp breath, running a hand through his hair, his composure unraveling piece by piece. "Do you even understand what you've done?" he snapped, his voice rising now, echoing through the penthouse walls. "You don't call the police on me, not in this world, not ever." His eyes burned into hers, a warning laced with something darker, something that spoke of consequences far beyond a simple arrest. But Isabella didn't look away this time. Fear still coiled inside her, tight and suffocating, but beneath it, something stronger had begun to take shape. "I understand," she said softly, though her heart was pounding like it might break her ribs. "I understand that you hit me, and I won't let you do it again." For a moment time stretched thin, balanced on the edge of something irreversible. Alessio stared at her as if trying to decide whether to laugh, to shout, or to destroy everything in front of him. His fists clenched at his sides, muscles tense, jaw tight. Then, from somewhere below, faint but unmistakable, came the sound that changed everything. Sirens. Distant at first, barely audible beneath the storm, but growing louder with every passing second. The sound sliced through the tension like a blade cutting straight into Alessio's composure. His head turned sharply toward the windows, his breath catching as reality settled in. This wasn't a threat. It wasn't a bluff. It was happening. "You stupid woman," he muttered under his breath, his voice trembling now with something far more unstable than anger. "You have no idea what you've just started." He began pacing, running his hands over his face, his movements restless, agitated, like a caged animal realizing the door was closing. The dispatcher's voice returned, clearer now, guiding Isabella through each breath, each second. "They're almost there. Stay where you are. Keep the door accessible." Isabella nodded faintly, even though the woman on the other end couldn't see her. Her legs felt weak, but she forced herself to stay upright, to stay grounded. She had already gone too far to turn back. The sirens grew louder, echoing off the buildings outside, flashing lights beginning to flicker against the glass walls, painting the room in red and blue. The storm outside seemed to rage harder, as if the world itself was reacting to what was unfolding inside. Alessio stopped pacing, his body going rigid as he stared at the door, his breathing uneven. A heavy knock shattered the silence. "Police, open the door." The words echoed through the penthouse like a final verdict. Isabella's heart pounded as she turned toward the entrance, each step feeling heavier than the last, but more certain too. Behind her, Alessio didn't move. For the first time since she had known him, he looked unsure. Not powerful, not untouchable, just a man standing at the edge of something he could no longer control. Her hand reached the handle, and as she opened the door, letting the outside world step into the life he had tried to keep sealed, Isabella knew one thing with absolute certainty. There was no going back. The door closed behind the officers with a final, heavy click that seemed to echo longer than it should have, like the sound itself was sealing something shut forever. The flashing lights faded from the glass walls, the sirens dissolved into the distance, and for the first time in years, the penthouse fell into a silence that did not belong to him. It should have felt like relief. It should have felt like freedom. But as Isabella stood there in the middle of the vast room, one hand still pressed protectively over her stomach, the other hanging at her side, she realized that silence could still feel like a weight pressing down on her chest. Because now there was nothing left to distract her from the truth. Her gaze drifted slowly across the space, over the polished marble floors, the towering glass windows, the expensive furniture that had once felt like proof that she had made it into a better life. Now, all she saw was emptiness. This had never been a home. It had been a stage, a carefully constructed illusion designed to make everything look perfect from the outside, while something inside it quietly rotted. She took a slow step forward, her bare feet cold against the floor, and the memory hit her without warning. She had been standing in a completely different place the first time she met him. A crowded charity gala filled with laughter and music, her simple dress feeling out of place among diamonds and silk. She had almost left early, overwhelmed by a world that didn't feel like hers, until he appeared. Alessio Morti had walked into her life like a man carved from certainty, his presence commanding attention without effort. He had smiled at her as if she was the only person in the room, as if she wasn't invisible, as if she belonged. That was the first lie he ever told her, though she hadn't known it then. Her hand tightened slightly over her belly as she moved toward the window, watching the city stretch endlessly below. Back then, everything about him had felt larger than life. His confidence, his ambition, the way he spoke about building something powerful, something untouchable. He had promised her protection, a future where she would never have to worry, never have to struggle the way she once had. And she had believed him, because she had wanted to believe that love could exist even in a world built on power and control. The memory shifted, darker now, sharper. Their wedding. A quiet, elegant ceremony filled with people she didn't know, men who watched everything too closely and spoke too carefully. She remembered the way Alessio had held her hand, his grip firm, reassuring, his voice low when he whispered his vows. "You'll always be safe with me." Those words had wrapped around her like a shield. She hadn't realized then that a shield could also be a cage. Another step, another memory. The penthouse, newly furnished, spotless, untouched. She had stood in the middle of it, overwhelmed by its size, by the way it seemed to swallow her whole. Alessio had stood behind her, his hands on her shoulders, guiding her gaze across the city as if he was showing her the world he owned. "This is our life now," he had said, pride threading through his voice. But it hadn't been their life. It had always been his. Her breathing slowed as the truth settled deeper inside her. She hadn't noticed the change at first. It had been gradual, almost invisible. Late nights that turned into early mornings. Conversations that became shorter, colder. His touch that once felt warm becoming something distant, mechanical. And then the silence began. Not the peaceful kind, but the kind that made you question your own existence. The kind that made you feel like you were fading out of your own life. Her eyes dropped to her reflection in the glass, barely visible against the city lights. She looked different now. Not just because of the child she carried, but because something inside her had shifted in a way she couldn't undo. She had spent so long convincing herself that she just needed to be patient, to be understanding, to be strong enough to hold everything together. She had told herself that his world was complicated, that his responsibilities were heavy, that love sometimes meant enduring more than you wanted to. But standing there now, with the storm still raging faintly outside and the echo of that slap still burning against her skin, she understood something she had refused to see before. She had not been holding the marriage together. She had been holding herself inside it. The realization hit harder than anything he had said, harder than anything he had done. It stripped away every excuse she had made for him, every reason she had given herself to stay silent, because silence had not protected her. It had only made it easier for him to forget she was even there. Her hand moved slowly, almost unconsciously, rubbing gentle circles over her stomach. The baby shifted again, a small movement, but enough to ground her, enough to remind her that she wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. For a long time, she had thought love meant sacrificing parts of herself to keep someone else whole. But now she saw the truth in a way that felt both painful and freeing. Love was not supposed to erase you. It was supposed to make you feel seen. Behind her, the penthouse remained still, empty in a way it had never been before. No footsteps, no voice, no presence filling the space with control, just her, just the quiet. And for the first time, that quiet didn't feel like something she needed to escape from. It felt like something she needed to understand. Because deep down, beneath the fear, beneath the pain, something new was beginning to take shape. Not loud, not obvious, but steady. A realization that this wasn't just the end of something. It was the beginning of something far more dangerous. And far more powerful. Because now she knew the truth. And she was no longer afraid to face it. The city never truly slept, but there were hours when it changed, when the noise softened just enough for secrets to move more freely through its veins. That was the hour Alessio Morty had grown accustomed to, the hour where power wore a different face, less polished, more dangerous. Long before Isabella ever stepped into his world, there had been another place, another rhythm to his nights. It lived behind velvet curtains and dim lights, in rooms where deals were whispered instead of signed, and loyalty was measured in silence, not words. That was where Valentina first appeared, not like a woman searching for attention, but like someone who already knew she had it. She hadn't approached him the way others did, with eagerness or fear. She had watched him first, studied him from across the room, her presence subtle but deliberate. Alessio noticed because men like him always noticed when something didn't behave as expected. When she finally stepped into his space, it wasn't with hesitation, but with quiet confidence, her voice low and smooth as she spoke his name as if she had known it long before that night. He had been intrigued. Not because she was beautiful, though she was, but because she did not try to impress him. She understood him, or at least she made him believe she did. Valentina knew exactly what Alessio needed to hear, even before he said it out loud. She listened when he spoke about power, about expansion, about the weight of control, and instead of questioning him, she fed it, sharpened it, made it feel larger than it already was. She laughed at the right moments, challenged him just enough to keep his interest, and never once asked for anything that would make her seem dependent. That was the difference. She didn't want to belong to his world. She wanted to stand inside it as something equal, something dangerous. And Alessio, blinded by his own need to feel understood, never stopped to question why she fit so perfectly into the spaces his wife never could. Isabella had never seen that side of him, not fully. To her, Alessio had always been controlled, calculated, distant but composed. But with Valentina there were no limits, no expectations to maintain a certain image. The nights he spent with her were loud, reckless, filled with indulgence and ego, a version of himself that fed on validation and excess. She encouraged it, every moment carefully crafted to pull him deeper into a version of himself he didn't realize was being shaped. And every time he walked away from her, He carried something back with him, something invisible but undeniable, something that slowly poisoned everything waiting for him at home. What Alessio never realized was that Valentina never truly looked at him the way Isabella once had. There was no softness in her gaze when he wasn't paying attention, no quiet loyalty rooted in something real. Instead, there was calculation, a flicker of something colder, something that measured every word, every action, every weakness. She had studied him long before she ever touched him, learned the cracks in his armor, the patterns in his behavior, the vulnerabilities hidden beneath his arrogance. And while he believed he was the one in control, she had already begun weaving something far more intricate beneath the surface. There were moments, small and fleeting, where the illusion almost slipped. A text message she quickly dismissed, a glance at her phone when she thought he wasn't looking, a tension in her posture when certain names were mentioned, names tied to families Alessio considered allies or at least stable enough to trust. But those moments passed quickly, buried beneath charm and distraction, and Alessio, consumed by his own reflection in her attention, never looked closely enough to see the pattern forming. Meanwhile, inside the penthouse, Isabella sat in the quiet aftermath of a life unraveling, unaware that the betrayal she had endured was only one layer of something far deeper. The perfume that clung to Alessio's clothes was not just the scent of another woman, but the trace of something far more dangerous, something that extended beyond emotion into strategy, into power, into a game that had been set in motion long before she ever realized she was part of it. Somewhere across the city, Valentina stood alone on a balcony high above the streets, her fingers wrapped around a glass she had barely touched. The night air moved through her hair as she stared out at the skyline, her expression unreadable, detached. Her phone lit up in her hand, a message appearing on the screen, brief and precise. She read it once, then again, her lips curving into the faintest hint of a smile, not warm, not pleased, but knowing. She typed a response without hesitation, her movements calm, deliberate, as if this was not a reaction but part of a plan already unfolding exactly as expected. The message sent, she lowered the phone slowly, her gaze drifting back toward the city. Alessio believed he was building something untouchable. Isabella believed she had lost everything. But neither of them could see the truth yet, the deeper current moving beneath their lives, pulling everything toward a collision that would not just break a marriage, but dismantle an empire piece by piece. And as the storm clouds slowly began to clear above the skyline, the calm that followed carried something far more dangerous than thunder. It carried intention. Morning didn't arrive gently. It crept into the penthouse like something unwelcome, thin light slipping through the towering glass walls and exposing every crack, every shadow, every truth Isabella had tried not to see. The storm had passed, but the aftermath remained, heavy and still. The city outside had already begun moving again, indifferent to what had happened here, indifferent to the way one life had just been split into before and after. Isabella stood near the kitchen island, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea she hadn't touched, her eyes distant, her mind replaying everything in fragments that refused to settle. The silence wasn't empty anymore, it felt watched. At first she told herself it was fear, that it was natural after everything to feel like something was still lurking, waiting, breathing just beyond sight. But then she noticed it, small things, subtle, almost insignificant. The security panel near the hallway flickered once, then steadied. A faint click echoed from somewhere deeper in the apartment, too mechanical to belong to pipes or walls. Her breath slowed, her senses sharpening. This place had never truly been hers. It had always belonged to him. Every camera, every sensor, every locked door, all connected to a system she had never been allowed to fully understand. A knock came at the door. Not loud, not urgent, just controlled. Isabella froze. Her heart began to pound again, not with panic, but with something more alert, more focused. Alessio couldn't be here. Not yet. Not after what had happened. But that didn't mean the danger had passed. In his world, he didn't need to be present to still have reach. She moved slowly, carefully, her hand instinctively pressing against her stomach as she approached the door. Her reflection in the polished surface stared back at her, pale, tired, but no longer uncertain. She checked the monitor. A man stood on the other side, alone, composed, wearing a dark coat that seemed too deliberate for the quiet morning. His posture was relaxed, but his eyes were not. They were sharp, observant, scanning without moving, as if he was already aware of everything inside. She didn't recognize him, but something about him felt familiar in a way she couldn't explain. not comforting, just known. After a moment's hesitation, she unlocked the door. He didn't step in immediately. He waited, giving her the choice or the illusion of one. "Isabella Morty," he said, his voice calm, low, precise. "We need to talk." She studied him for a second longer, then stepped aside. He entered quietly, his gaze moving through the space with subtle precision, not curiosity, not admiration, just assessment, as if he was cataloging everything. The room, the angles, the exits. Nothing about him felt accidental. He wasn't here out of concern. He was here with purpose. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice steady despite the tension tightening in her chest. He reached into his coat slowly, deliberately, pulling out a small object and placing it on the marble counter between them. A flash drive, black, unmarked. It made a soft sound as it touched the surface, but the weight of it felt heavier than anything in the room. "My name doesn't matter," he said. "What matters is what's on that." Isabella didn't move. Her eyes stayed on the device, her mind already racing through possibilities she didn't want to consider. "What is it?" she asked, though part of her already knew the answer wouldn't be simple. "Proof," he replied. "Not just of what you already know, of what you don't." The words settled slowly. The air in the room seemed to shift. "Your husband isn't just reckless," he continued, his tone unchanged, almost detached. "He's careless, and when men like him become careless, they leave trails. Financial, operational, personal. This is one of them." Isabella's fingers curled slightly at her side, resisting the urge to reach for it too quickly. "Why are you giving this to me?" she asked. For the first time, his expression changed, not into a smile, not into warmth, just something slightly more defined. "Because you've already done something no one expected you to do," he said. "You broke silence. That changes everything." Her breath caught slightly. He wasn't wrong. But this, he gestured lightly toward the drive, is what turns that moment into leverage. Silence stretched between them, thick charged. Isabella finally stepped forward. Her hand hovered above the flash drive for a brief second, as if she understood, even without seeing it, that touching it would mean stepping into something far larger than herself, something irreversible. Then she picked it up. It felt cold, solid, final. "What happens if I use it?" she asked quietly. The man's gaze met hers, unwavering now. "Then he doesn't just lose you," he said. "He loses everything." The words settled deep. Not dramatic, not exaggerated. Just true. And for the first time since the night had shattered her world, Isabella felt something unfamiliar rise beneath the fear, beneath the pain. Not hope. Not yet. But something close to power. Because whatever was inside that small piece of metal was no longer his secret. It was hers. Message arrived before sunset, not with a sound but with a presence, a quiet vibration against the marble counter where Isabella had left her phone untouched for hours. The screen lit up in the fading light, a single line of text sitting there like something alive, something waiting to be acknowledged. No number, no name, just words. "You shouldn't have opened that door." She didn't need to ask who it was from. The tone carried him, the same controlled menace that had once wrapped itself in charm and promises. Only now it didn't pretend anymore. Now it spoke plainly. Isabella stood still for a long moment, her eyes fixed on the message, her fingers resting lightly against the edge of the counter. The flash drive sat beside the phone, small, silent, yet somehow louder than everything else in the room. She had watched it earlier, alone, the footage unfolding in front of her with a clarity that left no room for denial. Alessio shouting in a private suite, his control slipping, his violence no longer contained. Valentina's face shifting from amusement to something closer to calculation, and beneath it all, numbers, accounts, transfers that stretched across borders and into shadows she had never been allowed to see. It wasn't just proof of betrayal. It was a map of his empire, and maps could be used to destroy as easily as they were used to build. The elevator chimed softly somewhere beyond the private hallway, a sound so subtle it would have gone unnoticed before. Not now. Now every detail carried weight. Isabella's breath slowed, her body instinctively tightening as she turned her head toward the corridor. No one was supposed to have access, not without permission, not without him. Yet the system hadn't alerted her. No warning, no resistance, which meant one thing: the access hadn't been forced. It had been allowed. Footsteps followed, measured, unhurried. The kind that belonged to someone who didn't need to rush because they already owned the space they were walking into. The door at the end of the hall opened with a soft click, and then he was there. Alessio Morti. He looked different, not disheveled, not careless. Composed again, every detail in place, his suit immaculate, his expression calm. But the calm was thinner now, stretched tight over something darker beneath. His eyes found hers immediately, locking onto her with a focus that made the room feel smaller. "You really thought I'd stay away?" he asked, his voice low, almost conversational, as if they were discussing something trivial instead of standing on the edge of something irreversible. Isabella didn't step back this time. Her hand rested against her stomach, steady, grounded, her gaze holding his without hesitation. "You shouldn't be here," she said quietly. A faint smile touched his lips, but it didn't reach his eyes. "This is my home." The words hung there, familiar, once powerful. Now they sounded hollow. "It was," she replied, the difference small but sharp enough to cut. Something flickered across his face, brief, controlled, gone almost as quickly as it appeared. He walked further into the room, his presence filling the space again, but it felt different now. Less absolute, less certain. "I heard about the call," he continued, his tone shifting slightly, the edge beneath it becoming more visible. "The police, the scene you made, you embarrassed me." Isabella's fingers curled slightly against her palm, not in fear but in restraint. "You did that yourself." For a second, silence stretched between them, heavy, charged. Alessio stopped a few steps away from her, close enough that she could see the tension in his jaw, the way his control was being held together by something thinner than before. "You don't understand the position you've put yourself in," he said, his voice lowering further, almost a warning. "This isn't about us anymore. It's bigger than that. You've drawn attention from people who don't forgive mistakes." Her eyes didn't waver. "I didn't make the mistake." His gaze sharpened, the patience in it thinning. "You opened a door that was meant to stay closed." Isabella glanced briefly toward the counter, toward the flash drive still lying there, visible, undeniable. Alessio's eyes followed the movement, landing on it, and for the first time something real broke through his composure. Not anger, not yet, something closer to recognition. Understanding. The air shifted. "You've been busy," he said softly, stepping closer now, his attention no longer on her alone but on what she held. "Do you even know what that is?" "I know enough," she replied, her voice calm, though her heartbeat had begun to rise again, faster now, stronger. Alessio exhaled slowly, running a hand over his face, his control slipping just enough to reveal the pressure beneath it. "That's not just evidence," he said. "That's a weapon, and weapons don't just hurt the person you point them at. They destroy everything around them." The words lingered, heavy with implication. But Isabella didn't move, didn't look away. "Maybe everything needs to be destroyed," she said quietly. That was the moment the tension broke. Not loudly, not violently, but completely. Alessio's eyes darkened, the last trace of restraint dissolving as he stepped even closer, his voice dropping into something colder, something far more dangerous. "If you use that," he said, each word deliberate, controlled, "you don't just destroy me." His gaze locked onto hers, unyielding now. "You make yourself a target." The warning settled deep, not as fear but as truth. And for the first time, Isabella didn't try to deny it. Because she could feel it now, the shift, the line she had crossed, the world she had stepped into. This was no longer about survival. This was war. Night didn't bring rest. It brought clarity, the kind that arrives slowly, quietly, and refuses to leave once it settles in. The penthouse no longer felt like a place she needed to endure. It felt like something she needed to understand before she could walk away from it completely. Isabella stood in front of the mirror long after the city lights had dimmed, studying her reflection not with doubt this time, but with a kind of distance, as if she was seeing herself from the outside for the first time. The mark on her cheek had faded to a faint shadow, but she didn't try to cover it. It wasn't something she needed to hide anymore. It was something she needed to remember. Her gaze dropped briefly to her stomach, her hand resting there with a steadiness that hadn't been there before. The child inside her shifted, a quiet movement that grounded her in a way nothing else could. For days, everything had been about reaction, about surviving each moment as it came. But now something deeper had taken hold, a realization that surviving wasn't enough. Not anymore. Not when the world she was standing in demanded more than endurance. It demanded control. She turned away from the mirror and walked toward the living area, her movements calm, deliberate, every step carrying intention. The flash drive sat on the table where she had left it, untouched since Alessio's warning but not forgotten. It had changed everything the moment she watched it. Not just what she knew about him, but what she understood about the structure around him. The network, the money, the quiet exchanges hidden behind carefully maintained images. It wasn't chaos. It was a system. And systems could be studied, broken, rebuilt. Her phone buzzed softly, the sound no longer jarring, no longer something she feared. She picked it up without hesitation this time. A message, not from Alessio, not from anyone she recognized, just a location and a time. No explanation, no instruction, just an invitation that didn't feel optional. For a moment she stared at it, her mind moving quickly, calculating in a way she hadn't allowed herself to before. This wasn't random. Nothing in his world ever was. If someone was reaching out now, it meant one thing. She had been seen, not as a victim, not as a wife, as something else. She placed the phone down slowly, her expression unreadable, her thoughts settling into something sharper, more focused. Fear didn't disappear. It changed shape, became something she could use instead of something that controlled her. Alessio had been right about one thing. She had opened a door, but he had been wrong about what would happen next, because he still believed she didn't understand the world she was stepping into. She reached for the flash drive, turning it slightly in her fingers, feeling its weight again. It wasn't just leverage anymore. It was a key, not just to bringing him down, but to seeing the full scope of what he had built, and more importantly, where it was weakest. The memory of his words lingered in the back of her mind, not as a threat, but as a confirmation. You make yourself a target. The truth was, she already had been. She just hadn't realized it before. The difference now was that she could see it, and once you saw something clearly, it became harder for it to control you. She moved toward the window, the city stretching endlessly beneath her, alive with movement, with quiet deals and louder ambitions. Somewhere out there, decisions were being made about her, about what she meant now, about what she might become. But for the first time, she didn't feel small in comparison to it. She felt connected to it. Not in the way Alessio had been, through dominance and control, but in a way that was more precise, more intentional. Her reflection stared back at her again in the glass, but this time it didn't look uncertain. It didn't look lost. It looked focused, still calm, still quiet. But underneath it, something had shifted completely. She picked up her coat, slipping it on without hesitation, her movements steady, her breathing even. This wasn't an escape. It wasn't running. It was a step forward, a choice she was making on her own terms. As she reached the door, her hand paused briefly on the handle, not out of doubt, but acknowledgement. Everything behind her had shaped who she was, but it no longer defined where she was going. She opened the door and stepped out into the corridor, the quiet hum of the building surrounding her, the path ahead uncertain but no longer something she feared. Because this wasn't the same woman who had sat in silence, waiting for someone to come home. This was someone who had stopped waiting entirely. And somewhere, beyond the walls of the life she was leaving behind, the next move was already waiting for her. The courthouse rose out of the city like something older than the streets around it, its stone facade carved with the quiet weight of decisions that had ended lives and rewritten others without ever raising its voice. By the time Isabella stepped out of the car, the air was already charged, thick with anticipation, and something sharper beneath it. Cameras flashed before she even reached the steps, their bursts of light cutting through the gray morning like sudden lightning. Voices followed, overlapping, urgent, calling her name as if they already knew her story, as if they had been waiting for this moment long before she arrived. She didn't look at them. She didn't slow. Her hand rested lightly against her stomach, her posture steady, her pace deliberate, each step a quiet refusal to be pulled back into the version of herself that once would have hesitated. Inside, the noise shifted into something contained, controlled, but no less intense. The courtroom carried a different kind of tension, one that didn't rely on chaos to exist. It lived in the way people sat, in the way eyes followed movement without turning heads, in the way silence settled just a fraction too heavy between words. Isabella felt it the moment she crossed the threshold, felt the attention without needing to look for it. Not all of it belonged to the press. Some of it was quieter, colder, watching from places that didn't draw notice unless you knew what to look for. Observers who weren't there for justice, but for outcome, for consequence. Alessio was already seated when she entered. He didn't turn immediately. He didn't need to. His presence filled the space in a way that was familiar and distant at the same time. Composed, controlled, the image he had always perfected in public, but now there was something strained beneath it, something holding too tightly to the surface. When his eyes finally met hers, the connection was immediate and unyielding, a silent exchange that carried everything words could not. There was no apology there, no regret, only calculation. Only the quiet promise that whatever happened here would not end with the sound of a gavel. Isabella didn't look away. She moved to her seat beside her attorney, her movements smooth, intentional, her expression unreadable. The room seemed to adjust around her, as if recalibrating to something it hadn't expected. She could feel it in the shift of attention, in the way conversations died down just slightly as she passed, in the way even the smallest details seemed to sharpen in her awareness. This was not the same room she would have walked into weeks ago, and she was not the same woman. Proceedings began without ceremony. Words were exchanged, formal, structured, but beneath them ran a current that had nothing to do with legal language. It was a negotiation of power, of perception, of what could be proven and what could be buried. Alessio's lawyer spoke first, his tone confident, practiced, dismissive in a way that was meant to shrink her back into something smaller. He spoke of stress, of misunderstanding, of exaggeration, building a narrative designed to reduce what had happened into something manageable, something forgettable. Isabella listened without interruption, her gaze steady, her breathing even, her focus not on the performance, but on the moment it would collapse. When her attorney stood, the room shifted again. There was no rush, no need to compete with volume or force. The strength in her voice came from precision, from the way each word landed exactly where it needed to. Evidence was introduced carefully, deliberately, not as an attack but as a correction. Facts that did not bend, details that did not soften, and then the screen came alive. The footage played without commentary. Alessio, unguarded, unfiltered, the version of himself he had believed existed only in private. His voice raised, his control slipping, his actions undeniable. The room reacted not loudly but unmistakably, a ripple of tension that moved through every seat, every observer, every person who had come expecting a narrative and was now watching it unravel in real time. Isabella did not look at him. She didn't need to. The truth was no longer something she had to carry alone. But it didn't stop there. The financial records followed, quiet lines of numbers that spoke louder than any accusation, connections that stretched beyond what had been assumed, patterns that suggested something far more complex than personal failure. The courtroom was no longer just a place of judgment. It had become something else entirely, a point of exposure. Alessio's composure held, but barely. It showed in the tension of his shoulders, in the way his jaw tightened just a fraction too long, in the brief flicker of something behind his eyes when the evidence moved beyond the personal into the structural. This was no longer about a single moment. It was about everything that moment had revealed. When Isabella was called to speak, the room settled into a deeper silence. She stood slowly, not because she was unsure, but because she understood the weight of the moment. Every step toward the stand felt grounded, intentional, each one carrying her further away from who she had been and closer to something she had not yet fully named. She didn't rush her words when they came. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "I stayed silent because I thought it would keep the peace," she said, her tone calm, clear, unwavering. "But silence doesn't protect you. It protects the person who's hurting you." The words didn't echo. They didn't need to. They settled. And in that stillness, something shifted again. Because this was no longer just a case. It was a turning point. And somewhere beyond the walls of the courtroom, forces that had remained quiet were beginning to move in response. The courtroom never fully recovered from the moment the footage ended. Even as the screen went dark, the images seemed to linger in the air, clinging to every surface, every breath, every shifting glance. What had been controlled, rehearsed, and predictable only minutes earlier had turned into something fragile, something unpredictable. Isabella could feel it in the way the room held itself now, tighter, more alert, as if everyone present understood that whatever came next would not follow the script anyone had prepared for. Alessio remained seated, but the stillness in him no longer carried authority. It felt forced, constructed, as though he was holding himself together piece by piece while something beneath him quietly gave way. His lawyer leaned in, speaking quickly, urgently, but Alessio didn't respond right away. His eyes were fixed ahead, unblinking, calculating, searching for an angle that might still exist, for a path that had not yet been cut off. But the room had changed too much for that. The shift was irreversible now. Then movement broke the tension. At the back of the courtroom, a chair scraped softly against the floor. It wasn't loud, but it was enough. Enough to draw attention without asking for it. Enough to pull every gaze in that direction at once. Isabella turned slightly, her breath slowing as she recognized the figure standing there. Valentina. She didn't look the same as she had in the footage. The sharp confidence, the effortless control, the subtle arrogance that had once defined her presence, it was still there but altered, stripped down, reshaped into something more deliberate. She wasn't hiding anymore. She wasn't performing. She was choosing to be seen. For a brief second, Alessio didn't move, and then he turned. The moment his eyes found her, something fractured completely. It was subtle. Anyone who didn't know him might have missed it, but Isabella saw it. The exact instant his certainty collapsed. Not because of fear, not because of guilt, but because of recognition. Because whatever he had believed about Valentina, whatever version of control he thought he held over her, was gone. Valentina stepped forward without hesitation, her heels echoing softly against the floor as she moved toward the center of the room. There was no rush in her movement, no sign of uncertainty. She didn't look at Alessio again, not even once. Her focus remained ahead, on the judge, on the space where truth was no longer optional. "I need to speak," she said, her voice steady, carrying easily across the silence. There was a pause, brief but significant, as if the room itself needed a moment to process what was unfolding. Then permission was granted, and everything shifted again. Valentina didn't sit, she didn't fidget, she didn't soften her tone or search for sympathy. When she spoke, it was direct, precise, and impossible to misinterpret. "Alessio Morti is not who he presents himself to be," she began, her gaze unwavering. "And what you've seen so far is only a fraction of it." A ripple moved through the room, not loud but unmistakable. Isabella felt it too, a tightening in her chest, not from fear but from anticipation. This wasn't just confirmation. This was escalation. Alessio stood abruptly, the movement sharp enough to break the rhythm of the moment. "You don't get to do this," he said, his voice low but strained, the control in it slipping. "Sit down." Valentina didn't even glance at him. Instead, she reached into her bag and pulled out a thin folder, placing it carefully on the surface in front of her. "Offshore accounts," she continued calmly. "Transactions routed through 3 different networks, all tied back to him. Funds moved in ways that can't be traced without knowing exactly where to look." She opened the folder, sliding documents forward one by one, each movement measured, intentional. "I know because I was part of it," she added, the admission landing without hesitation, without defense. "But not in the way he thinks." The words settled like a weight. Alessio's expression darkened, his composure unraveling faster now, the cracks no longer small enough to hide. "You're making a mistake," he said, louder this time, his voice carrying across the room, edged with something close to desperation. "You think they'll protect you. You think turning on me changes anything." Valentina finally turned her head, her gaze meeting his directly for the first time. And there was nothing there. No fear, no loyalty, no hesitation. "Everything changes," she said quietly. Silence followed, heavy, complete, absolute. Because in that moment, it became clear to everyone present that this was no longer a defense. It was an unraveling, a dismantling that had been set in motion long before this room, long before this day. Isabella watched it all unfold without moving, her breath steady, her posture unchanged. She didn't need to speak. She didn't need to react. The truth was no longer something she had to fight to be heard. It was speaking for itself. And as Alessio stood there, no longer the untouchable figure he had built himself to be, Isabella understood something with complete clarity. This wasn't just the fall of a man. It was the collapse of everything he had believed could never be taken from him. The silence after Valentina's words did not break quickly. It deepened, settled, and pressed down on the courtroom like something final, something that could not be undone no matter what was said next. Alessio remained standing for a moment longer, his chest rising and falling, his gaze fixed somewhere beyond the room as if he could still find a way to pull everything back into his control. But control had already slipped through his fingers. Not in a dramatic collapse, not in a sudden explosion, but in something far more devastating. Piece by piece, truth by truth, until there was nothing left to hold onto. The judge's voice eventually cut through the tension, steady, measured, restoring structure to a moment that had spiraled beyond expectation. Proceedings moved forward, but the rhythm had changed. Every word now carried consequence, every pause felt heavier, as if the outcome had already been decided long before it would be spoken aloud. Isabella remained seated, her hand resting over her stomach, her presence calm, grounded, untouched by the chaos that had surrounded her for so long. She did not look at Alessio again. She did not need to see him fall to understand that he already had. When the ruling came, it did not arrive with drama. It arrived with certainty. Legal language wrapped around decisions that would reshape everything. Protection orders, financial restrictions, custody secured in her favor before the child had even entered the world. Each sentence closed another door behind him, each word narrowing the space he had once occupied, until there was nothing left of the empire he had built but fragments scattered across a system that no longer protected him. The room absorbed it quietly, the reactions controlled but undeniable. This was not just a verdict, it was an ending. Alessio didn't react immediately. He stood still, the weight of it settling slowly, his expression unreadable at first. Then something shifted. Not rage, not resistance, something colder, something emptier. The kind of realization that comes when there are no more moves left to make, when the game has already been lost, even if the final piece has not yet been placed. His eyes moved once more, finding Isabella across the room. There was no threat in them now, no promise of retaliation. Just a quiet acknowledgement of something he had never expected, that she had not only survived him, she had undone him. Isabella held his gaze for a moment, not out of obligation, not out of emotion, but out of clarity. This was the last time she would ever see him this way. Not as a figure of power, not as someone who could define her world, but as a man who had mistaken control for permanence. And then she looked away. Outside, the world was already waiting. The courthouse steps were filled with movement, with voices, with flashes of light that followed her the moment she stepped into view. Reporters called out. Questions layered over each other, narratives forming in real time as they tried to capture something that could never fully be explained in a headline. Isabella paused at the top of the steps, the city stretching out before her, alive, unchanged, yet somehow different in the way it met her now. She could feel the attention, the weight of it, but it no longer pressed down on her. It moved around her instead. She didn't speak immediately. She didn't rush to fill the silence. When she did, her voice was calm, steady, carrying just far enough to be heard without needing to be forced. "I thought silence would protect me," she said, her hand resting lightly against her stomach. "But silence only protected the person who was hurting me. Today, I chose something different." The words settled into the space between her and the crowd, simple, unadorned, but complete. She did not elaborate. She did not need to. The reaction came in waves, applause from some, quiet understanding from others, cameras capturing the moment, framing it, turning it into something that would be repeated, analyzed, remembered. But Isabella didn't stay long enough to become part of that cycle. She turned, moving away from the steps, away from the noise, towards something that did not require an audience to exist. Days passed, then weeks, and the city moved on as it always did. Stories replaced stories. Names faded into new ones. But for Isabella, the change was not something that disappeared with time. It settled deeper, reshaping her life in ways that were not loud, not dramatic, but permanent. The penthouse was no longer hers. It never truly had been. She left it behind without looking back, stepping into a space that felt smaller, simpler, but real in a way the other had never been. When the child came, the night was quiet. No storm, no chaos, just the steady rhythm of something new entering a world that had already been changed before it arrived. Isabella held her daughter close, her breath soft, her eyes closed for a moment as everything else fell away. The past did not disappear. It remained a part of her, a part of the path that had brought her here, but it no longer held her in place. She looked down at the small life in her arms, the weight of it grounding, undeniable. "We're free," she whispered, not as a promise but as a truth. And for the first time, it felt complete. Because this was not just the end of what had been. It was the beginning of something that belonged entirely to her.